Hello and welcome to Scottish Independence Podcasts. We're bringing you an episode of I Matters for Westminster about other voting systems, including the American system, the Irish system, and I thought it was a really interesting discussion. So here are MPs John MacNally and Martyn Day, along with a couple of guests, and hope you enjoy the discussion.
Hello and welcome back to the 6th episode of I Matters with myself and John MacNally MP, and we've got guests tonight. So tonight with us in the studio we have Bert McLennan. Bert, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Bert. I'm from Alabama. I work for Martyn Day and Amy Callahan MP, and I am wearing my McLennan family tartan tie tonight to just represent the American contingent, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. And we also have Calum Cooper.
Yeah, so my name's Calum. I live in Falkirk, local activist within the SNP here in Falkirk, and also within the youth wing of the SNP.
So our theme tonight is the democratic deficit, which we thought was pretty appropriate given everything that's been happening of late in the UK, but also it seems to be a global phenomenon, which I'm not sure Bert can elaborate on from the American point of view. We've certainly seen the latest developments with the deposit return scheme, which shows you that, you know, I say this tongue in cheek, but I think it's pretty appropriate. You'll have had your devolution. A bit like Ford's cars, you can decide anything you want as long as somebody else agrees with it, which isn't really devolution at all. So we're heading for, I think, a used car dealer election in the UK as well, because the choice is going to be more of the same irrespective of who wins, at least in terms of the constitution. So we've got to break that impasse. Bert, do you want to tell us a bit about the American situation? I always think our politics are a bit bonkers, and then I see what happens elsewhere in the world. I watched the last American Trump win for the time before, and you know he didn't even win the maximum number of votes, and it's just
no, he didn't. I'd say there was one glorious moment in about the summer of 2019, after 3 years of egregious undemocratic politics in the United States, when we became briefly very grateful to our friend Tories in the United Kingdom for making Brexit such an embarrassing disaster that it took the spotlight off us for a minute. But no, I think if you look back 25 years ago, most people in America would have thought that our system was the model for global democracy. We believed that we'd struck the right balance between liberty and representation and deliberation. And then in 2000, a 1.5 term governor from Texas, who freely admitted that he had no experience of foreign policy and no particular views of domestic policy, lost the national election by 500,000 votes to the vice president, Al Gore, and yet won the election because of 530 votes in Florida. I think that was an initial kind of democratic trauma for the people in the United States. But for a time, we assumed it was an aberration. And then just 16 years later, Donald Trump, this diseased reality TV star, haunted cheese puff, lost by 2.5 million votes to Hillary Clinton and still managed to win the election. And the effects of that, even though he's now been beaten, and even if he loses the next election, we have a Supreme Court, which, if the winner of the popular vote in the last 2 presidential elections had appointed the justices to it, would currently be 7-2 Democratic. But instead, it's stacked with 6 conservative justices who will be able to blunt the actions of every Democratic president for the next decade. It is, I think, a stark warning. If you see Democratic backsliding, get out ahead of it.
I think it's a very good warning, and we all need to be really cautious of democracy going the wrong direction, and there's too many evidence globally that is the case. We need a fairer system where not only is every vote counted, but every vote counts, and that's principal to us getting a fairer society where every view is held by the proportion of its electability. Calum, would you like to add anything to the discussion so far as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I will talk about, obviously, America. I'm not from America, but I think going on the sort of bottle return scheme was brought up. I think it's quite concerning, the news in the last little while. The UK sort of saying, you know, the British government, the Westminster government, saying that we're sick of devolution now. We're sick of, you know, these pesky gnats up in Scotland, you know, representing the people that they've been elected to represent. And actually, we're going to put a stop to it. And then when that kind of blows up in their face saying, oh, well, hang on, we're not putting a stop to it. We're fine with you, you having your democracy, but just not the way that you want it, right? We're going to say you can have your bottle return scheme, but no glass, just this arbitrary limitation. There are attacks on voter franchise itself, you will be having a Westminster election next year, which is terrifying, another election. But, we'll be having an election next year, and a lot of people will find in Scotland as well that they won't be able to vote because the Conservatives have seen fit to take that franchise away from them unless they manage to get ID for themselves.
Just buying in there, one of the Tory ministers today at the questions was asked about the electoral issues from that voter ID, and they were crowing. And I'm paraphrasing, you would need to check Hansard to get her exact words, but she was basically saying that the vast majority of people were able to vote. And that isn't the issue. The issue is a significant minority were denied their electoral franchise, and that skews the whole system. So absolutely possible. So apologies for butting in there, but that was sort of hot.
I think you're right. Even anecdotally, I mean, I've heard stories of people showing up looking to vote with documents that are completely valid. An Irish driver's license, for example, showed up to vote with an Irish driver's license, which is allowed, and we're told, nah, off you go away. So what's really scary about voter ID is not just, these examples of your over 60 Oyster card is valid, but your 18-year-old Oyster card is not for some reason. But even when you show up with valid documentation, being turned away and denied your right to vote, it's just another terrifying attack on democracy from the Conservatives. And Labour are not really much better at all. I mean, look at their own internal party democracy is just non-existent at this point, Even the prospect of a Labour government doesn't really fill me with much hope for democracy in the country. I think the best way to make sure that our voices are heard and that we are represented is to be independent, where we can trust that our government will protect our democracy.
No, absolutely. You're spot on there, Calum. That's the only way we get to any kind of democracy is with independence. I mean, the UK, as well as being a failed state on so many levels, you would struggle to actually say it's democratic. The majority of parliamentarians in the UK are unelected. That to me is a sign that it's not really democratic, and it's the only country other than Iran that has unelected clerics in its parliament. I mean, this is not a good advert, for the mother of parliament.
Well, I was just thinking, and even those that are elected have what kind of mandate? This current government, which has such a large majority that has effective absolute power over the UK state, bar the veto of the king, was elected on 43% of the vote, which is roughly the same share that Walter Mondale won in the United States in 1984, leading to a 49-state wipeout against him. The UK government, the UK House of Commons that initiated Brexit in 2017, was elected to a Tory majority government off of 37% of the vote, which is just madness. And I think it is a key area where really only with independence can we get a more democratic system like we have in Scotland, because Labour, we know already now, Keir Starmer said he has no intention of implementing proportional representation in the next parliament. When we look around the other place in the world to center-left parties, center-left federalist parties like the Liberals in Canada, who were elected the first time in 2015 on a pledge to implement proportional representation, once they get power at the national level, they suddenly lose interest in that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's since been totally scrapped. Unless Scotland goes independent, there is really no real prospect of moving to a system other than one in which 40+% of the population can elect a government with absolute power and completely ignore a nation like Scotland, even if it returns 58 out of 59 MPs for one party.
We're starting to get a few questions coming in. So the subject we're on there, just about the gerrymandering of the electoral system that's been going on. We've had Eddie Woofries has said, what's wrong with presenting your national insurance number? I don't think we really needed to present anything, to be perfectly honest, because the 29 election, which was the last Westminster one we had, to my knowledge, I believe there was only one person prosecuted for electoral fraud in the UK. So, I mean, that tells you that is not... And I think if there was to be a system, then it should be a national card that's issued to everybody so that there is nobody without the correct ID requirements. but there's no point really doing that. I mean, the fallback position. So yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Well, and I think this is just a quick thing from America, because we've been dealing with this now for over a decade, voter suppression through voter ID. The fact that there is no problem of voter fraud in this country, as demonstrated, as you said, one person prosecuted in 2019 election. The fact that there isn't, that they are bringing forward this change without there being an actual problem which it counters, is an indication that the motive is something different. It can't be to combat voter fraud, because there isn't voter fraud. The only other logical explanation for why they're doing this is because they believe it will suppress votes. So I think that's the answer to what's the problem with the question, with just presenting your national insurance number.
Yeah, and highlighted wonderfully by the very fact that, as Calum pointed out, that a young person's bus pass isn't counted, but an old person's is, because there's a belief that there's an age factor in the way people vote. I remember my mother had an expression from the referendum, where she said to me, "We can't let these people win." And I think that's the message we all need to be saying to everybody. We need to be a lot smarter than they are. The very fact that they are so transparently trying to gerrymander democracy in this country should be enough of a rallying point for any sort of decent-minded, liberal-thinking person to be saying, "Hold on a minute, this is not on," and to get a backlash against that. So let's hope that that's indeed what we see. What we see is maybe a repeat of what happened in the 2010 election in Scotland, where the anti-Tory vote was such that every anti-Tory MP was returned with a larger majority than they had the time before. And I think that's maybe the message we need to be getting out there, you know.
This is, since I was ready to talk about America, I think it is vital to get ahead of this now, because it began in the United States with, you just need to show a driver's license or a national insurance number. That was 15 years ago. By 3 years ago, it moved from there to questions of state legislatures being able to overturn the results of the popular election if there was a suspicion of fraud, and submit their own slate of electors, all the way up to the last election, the midterms in 2022, in which across the country people were running on an explicit pledge that if they were elected to oversee the elections in their state in 2024, they would deliver the election to Donald Trump. So once a party gets used to suppressing democracy, gets used to tweaking democracy, every next step is easier than the first one. If we shut it down now, it won't be too dangerous. But if this gets through, this voter suppressing voter ID policy gets through, then the next steps get progressively more dangerous.
But a comment there from Tina Chalmers saying, "Photo ID costs money. Do you agree this is an attempt to stop the poor from voting?" And certainly the poorer members of our society, also a lot of disabled people, those with learning difficulties, will be less likely to have the appropriate ID, and will find it in many cases more difficult to apply for and get the ID that's available. So it's definitely to stop the less advantaged from voting, to stop the younger people from voting, and it's to try and give, out and out, the Tories an advantage.
Women who wear the veil too.
Yeah. Hashbury Stumble had made a comment. It's just gone off the page. Best to register for a postal vote, and I would agree with that. They are bringing in changes to postal votes as well, which is the bad news. But at least you have that ready in advance, and it will apply for what at the moment is 5 years, but it will change to 3 years going forward. And there will be some requirement to again prove your identity when you apply for one. But at least once you have that, you just get every vote sent to you during that period, which I think is a much easier way than people turning up on the day, being denied their vote. People have busy lives and maybe not being able to return home, find their ID and get back to vote, especially if it's late at night or they're rushing before they go to their work. Or
I think the other thing that's interesting that has been said, it's almost like, the Tory government, they seem to have two ways of working. It's either incompetence or it's planned confusion. And maybe it's both in this case. I don't think they actually know. And one of the incidents that you mentioned earlier about people, I think it was Calum said it as well about the bus passes. So there were nurses going along to vote in their uniforms with their badges, working in probably next door to people in schools, and they were getting turned away because they didn't have what they were told was the right identification. So if you had actually wanted to organise this thing properly, it could have been done properly. But so therefore, you come to this conclusion it must be deliberate for this planned confusion. And the other thing you said, Martyn, which I thought was extremely interesting, it will have the desired effect because people say, "I can't be bothered with that." That is the point that then they've won, and that's how they see it. I think that's how they manipulate the system.
It's what social media companies, I think, call it adding friction. If you just make it ever so slightly harder to access the app, and a significant higher number of people won't do it.
Yeah, no, that's a very good phrase, I think. But yes, thanks for that. We've got a couple other questions that they're probably aimed at what we were talking about with Bert earlier there. Asbury Stumble was at the Hanging Chads, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yes, oh my lord, the Hanging Chads, that was the most absurd story of all. So Al Gore lost the 2000 presidential election by 537 votes in Florida. They started to recount the votes in Florida. They had these absurd, called the butterfly ballot, which was confusing enough to begin with. But the way that you voted was by taking a whole bunch and punching a hole in the ballot next to the name of the candidate you wanted. When they started the recount, they found a significant number of these ballots had turns out the name for a little circle of paper made when you punch a hole, it's called a Chad. And some of these, who knew? I don't believe that was the name before that. I think they made it up. But it was significant number of these ballots. The hole punch wasn't quite all the way through. Maybe there was a dent. Maybe it was almost all the way out, but the little circle, the Chad, was just hanging off by a thread. And the election auditor ruled that if the Chad was still in any way attached to the ballot, then the vote didn't count. And so that was, on the basis of hanging Chads, we got George W. Bush and the war on terror.
Well, there we go. With another comment from Charles Smith saying, does Bert have a view on the admission by a Trump cohort of stealing votes resulting in the actual winner losing? Have you heard? I'm not sure what person they're referring to there.
I haven't heard about that, and that must have been a local race. I do know that Trump is set to go on trial for putting in a call to the Georgia Secretary of State in a state that would very possibly have made the difference in the 2020 election after Election Day, saying, just find me 11,000 votes, and my congressman will take care of the rest. And that's what I'm saying. It starts with something that sounds sensible, like just require everybody to present their national insurance number. But because what they're actually doing, and what the Tories know they're doing, is tampering with the election, every time you do that, it gets a little bit easier to just crank it up until the point where, Boris Johnson is on the phone to the count in Surrey Hall South saying, just find me 50 more votes, and we'll get it through.
Yeah, we've had a comment on postal votes. Obviously, someone's concerned that they may be counted at the Tory HQ. I've watched postal votes over decades, and it is one of the most secure forms of voting. The ID checks that are there, they're held securely. I've seen every part of the process, so I've explained this on a number of occasions to people. It really is a secure system of voting. The only risk for postal votes, and it's not tampering with the vote that's cast, it would be if there was undue influence in the person's home when they're filling in the ballot, because that's where the potential secrecy of a ballot could be lost. It's something that can happen in some cases, families where there's a particularly domineering member. And I suspect on a political level, that probably cuts all ways, so everybody benefits and loses a bit by that. It's not something any of us would want to see, but again, it's relatively minor. Having said that, it's on a much larger scale, I would think, than actual voter impersonation, which is what we've got the whole voter ID about. So who knows what will come next in terms of the Tories' plans, because if they're worried about one person possibly fraudulently voting, what would they do about perhaps a few thousand people using undue influence?
Yeah, it's like they're trying to find an answer to a problem that doesn't exist. Doesn't exist, and it does now.
We're joined in the studio to my right with Bert McLennan, and we're joined online in the Falkirk area with Calum Cooper, and they're both giving us their takes from a national and international take on the democratic deficit, which is a very wide-ranging subject, but it's live just now in a way that it has not been live in a long time. And we've got a follow-up question from Charles Smith from the Attorney General's admission, probably in court.
So I don't know of a race being like of a Republican official recently confessing to throwing a race. It is possible that this is connected to, and you can do a Google and tell me if I'm right or wrong, Charles. There's the Attorney General of Texas has just recently been impeached by his own party because his corruption got so rampant that he was. I know that he was. No, it gets better. His corruption was so rampant, he was convicted in court, but, they gave him a settlement thing, so he was required to pay $2 million or something to settle this obscene corruption. And what he then did was submit a special bill to the Texas Senate to make the taxpayer pay his $2 million settlement for the corruption that he had carried out. So that was what finally made them say this is too much. So he's being prosecuted. It may well be that Ken Paxton has, in the process of all of this, admitted to rigging an election somewhere in Texas. I would just say I'm not surprised, but it's sad.
Yeah, the whole democratic deficit is sad. Calum, you've got some ideas on what we should be doing as a party, I believe.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to democracy and stuff like that, right, the important thing, and we've sort of touched on this, is that everybody has their voice heard and that our governments actually represent the political views of people, right? So we mentioned about the Tories getting a majority on like 37% of the vote is outrageous. That's the problem that we have with first past the post, as I'm sure we can all agree. But assuming that we're all on that, the system that we use in Scotland for local elections and back home in Ireland for every election, the single transferable vote is in my opinion fantastic, right? The way it works is you rank your candidates in order of preference. So, for example, I might say for argument's sake, I like the Green Party, right? I can rank the Green Party number 1, but I'm not worried about wasting my vote, because if the Green Party candidate does quite badly, then my vote will go to the second preference to the SNP candidate instead, because I rank SNP 2, maybe Labour 3, maybe, and so on and so on. So there's no sort of fear that we're going to lose our vote. But the key thing about single transferable vote is that you have multiple representatives in one constituency. So this means that if 20% of people vote for Labour, then around about 20% of the Parliament or of your constituency seats or whatever it might be, they will be Labour MPs or MSPs or whatever it is, councillors. If 30% vote SNP, 30% become SNP, and I'm quite worried about the maths here. What does that other 50% mean? But, and that's sort of how it ends up working. And that's really, really good. It means that if you are in sort of a minority in your political opinion in your constituency, you can still vote the way you feel without having to vote tactically for the least bad of two options, which is often the case when it comes to Westminster elections. The problem with the system that we have in Scotland right now is that goes completely out the window when it comes to by-elections. So I think one of the most egregious examples of this is the Forsyth ward in North Lanarkshire. Over the 2017 to 2022 term, they had two elections, one because the SNP councillor was elected as an MP, and one because the Conservative councillor bizarrely refused to take his seat. But because they had originally ended up with two Labour councillors, one SNP, one Tory, Labour being the biggest party in the ward, and those by-elections both went to Labour. So despite the fact that the SNP and the Tories combined got a higher share of the vote than Labour, they ended up with no representation, and Labour, with like 27% of the vote, ended up with 100% of the seats, which is worse than the worst of first past the post. There's not one Westminster constituency of all 650 where an MP has gotten elected representing 100% of the ward, the constituency, on 27%. So what I would propose is the system is very similar to the system that we use in Holyrood, where if a vacancy arises, but when a vacancy arises for a regional seat, that is just filled by the outgoing party. It's the same system that we have in Ireland for local elections as well. So if somebody leaves, then their party will nominate the replacement. Now, the criticism of this is essentially that they wouldn't have been voted for by individuals, that they would have been nominated by the party. But I think it's important that we sort of look realistically and honestly about how people vote in local elections. I could run for local council. I've no plans whatsoever to do so, but I could, and nobody here knows who I am. But they might see SNP and go, "Oh, I like SNP. I'll vote for him." They're not voting for me. They're voting for the party. And a lot of SNP councillors have very, very different views to each other. I think the leadership election kind of showed that a lot. But they get their seats because of their party, right? So essentially, that's what I would propose.
funnily enough, I've spoken about that before myself, because I went, before we had the first Scottish STV election, we went across to Ireland and met a number of the Irish parties, and that was one of the factors that they'd said they didn't have by-elections, which, you know, in itself is a saving to the public purse. But by co-opting a member of the party that lost the seat, you preserve the proportionality of the original election, which has to be a good thing, because it's the proportionality that's the strength of STV. I've often wondered if perhaps when it was brought in Scotland, we should have gone further and insisted on council structures to be proportionately representative as well. So it wasn't just the biggest cabal took all embracing power after the election and the proportionality was lost. So I think we're possibly on some similar pages there in terms of the debate.
Can I ask you, Calum? So, what kind of reaction are you getting to that suggestion? If you've spoke to quite a few people about it, what's the reaction been from others?
So the reaction's quite mixed, because I mean, you know, it's not something that we're sort of familiar with here, right? So any sort of change will have mixed reactions, I feel. And this isn't something that a lot of people have considered, it seems. So initially, when you say, hey, I think we can have more democracy by having less votes, some people kind of feel a little bit uneasy about that. And they're kind of like, well, hang on, how does that work, you know? But once I kind of explain it to people, once I sort of say, listen, this is actually the situation, you know, and they'll say, but people's opinions change. That's one of the arguments I've heard against it, is that people's opinions change, and when their mind changes, they deserve to have that heard. But that doesn't actually tend to be the case in practice. So, for example, in Amond and Erne, we increased our vote share. Parties can increase their vote share and still lose and still do quite badly. I'll give you some examples. In Fort William, the Tories increased their vote share by 8.5%, but still lost to the SNP. In Amond and Erne, the SNP, we increased our vote share by 7.7%, bringing us up to 37.3% of the total vote share. And the Conservatives decreased their vote share by 8.4%, and we still lost to the Tories, leaving us with no representation, despite having got 37.3% of the vote in that by-election. Melrose, the SNP, almost doubled our vote share from 17.8% to 30.2%, and still lost the seat. And then in Perth, we actually, very nice, we gained a majority in local council because of a by-election. But realistically, that's not what people voted for in Perth. So a by-election can actually flip control of the council from an SNP minority, where we have to work with other parties and listen to what other people have to say, to actually just being able to do whatever we want. And as nice as that is, right? That's not, for us, that's not actually what democracy looks like. You know, that's not respecting the actual outcome of the vote.
No, I think that's a fair point. I don't know who originally said this line. I remember one of the old party stalwarts from West Lothian, Angus McGilvery, who was a councillor in the old days and was at headquarters doing the publication stuff, used to often tell us, remember, democracy is just mob rule. So we've got to take it from that base mob rule into something that's truly proportionate and reflective of society, which is actually a modern democratic challenge for us all.
But I've got a question to ask Calum back. I'm going back to when I was elected as a councillor in 2005, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And at that time we had a ward. And it was a ward that was easily, your boundaries were easily identifiable. And then it became, they all amalgamated, multiple wards became one ward. Do you think that was something that people asked you? Should we go back to that type of system? Is that an easier system to understand in the bigger ward?
Are you talking about smaller wards with one single representative?
Yeah.
So I haven't. It's not come up when speaking with other people. But I know. I think if I remember correctly, that was something that you thought was better because you knew who you were going to and who your representative was, and it meant that everybody had sort of an equal amount of work. Whereas when you've got multiple representatives representing one ward, some people can be overburdened and other people not so much.
I have to say, as an elected member, it was fun being the sole member representing an area, but from a democratic point of view, it wasn't good for the public, and it meant the councils were in the same boat as Westminster is just now, where mob rule can be achieved on 35% of the vote, and the majority of people in an area could actually be opposed to the person that's representing them, which really isn't healthy at all. I have to say, I agree with what Calum said earlier. STV is the fairest system out there of the systems that I've seen. And indeed, I can recall a number of years ago, I think it was Donald Gorrie, the Liberal MSP, was suggesting something similar for Holyrood, and he was the only person I've seen come up with a really workable scheme. So I think there's a bit more work to be done on that kind of level going forward. Put a comment up on screen that Ashbury Stumble said about PR at Westminster probably leading to the Lib Dems being in eternal coalitions. That's one possibility. I think there's a much more likely outcome. And having looked at the political parties down here over the last 8 years, the Tories are 2 or 3 different parties merged into one, and the same is true of Labour. If you had a proper PR system, these parties would not survive the way they do. You would have a very different style of politics in the country. You would also have a much more positive style of politics because people would be voting positively for what they wanted, not, oh, that's the best of a bad lot, or I don't want this one. So I think it changes the whole dynamic if we had PR. So, and of course, it does mean that when you get electoral blocks, for want of a better expression, of different parties that would be likely to be allies, you may have power brokers, and that's just the nature of the beast. But I would hope that it would be more consensual. It would need to carry enough of the members in a chamber together to pass legislation. It wouldn't be the mob rule that we see with the Tories just now, with their 80-seat majority and complete detachment from reality and public opinion on so many issues. So a lot of positives.
I totally agree. That's exactly what I was thinking when I saw the question, and I think that's another reason why you can be confident that any kind of proportional representation will never be introduced by a UK government, because once, whether it was Labour or Conservative, they know that once they introduce that policy, they are signing the death warrant of their own party, at least for the next election. So yeah, I think, both history and logic suggest that the only way you get to that kind of fairer, more representative democratic system, at least for the people of Scotland, is in an independent Scotland.
Sorry, I was just going to say on coalitions as well. I don't necessarily agree that coalitions are a bad thing, as I think has been suggested somewhere in the chat. And I don't think it means that, one party's basically the kingmaker, one party's dictating. And, it means that a consensus can be formed, and quite the opposite. One party is not dictating. No one party has any power. Thinking about Ireland, for example, where we have seen the transferable vote for elections to the national parliament. There was a bit of a scenario there over the last week where people before profit who have 5 out of 160 or something like that TDs, they got a bill passed because the Green Party, who are in government, voted against the other 2 parties in government and voted with the opposition. So it means that parties are, there's a much more sort of, I guess, collaborative way of doing things on every issue, rather than just this is what the government wants, this is what the government wants, this is what the government wants. I'm sure, John and Martyn, you're kind of, I would imagine, sick and tired of just wanting to do whatever, wanting to be against whatever, and never, ever getting your way because of just this massive majority. Whereas if we broke things down and had, smaller parties which represent the sort of specific niches that they represent, because as you said, the Conservatives are sort of 3 parties in one, Labour are 3 parties in one, even the SNP, there are a lot of different views within the party on certain issues. I think a lot more could get done, because it's not just, all of the Tories are voting together on this issue and all of Labour are voting together on this issue, and a lot of people will be voting against what they actually believe and voting in line with parties. Whereas if we broke that down and we had a system of proportional representation, that wouldn't be as much an issue. So I think coalitions are a good thing, in that people can work more collaborative.
We had a couple of other questions that have came in. These ones are all for Bert, to be honest. You're obviously proving popular tonight, Bert. Ashbury Stumbles asked, how many candidates have announced they're running for the Republicans? Trump, Pence, DeSantis, and any others?
Mr. Stumble is clearly paying very close attention, because you've actually anticipated Mike Pence's announcement by about 24 hours. Mike Pence is expected to declare tomorrow, I believe, either tomorrow or Wednesday. There are 7 Republican candidates in the race right now. Trump, DeSantis, Tim Scott, who's the senator from South Carolina, Nikki Haley, who's the former governor of South Carolina, Asa Hutchinson, who's the former governor of Arkansas, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's an Indian-American tech entrepreneur with about $700 million, who's likely to make some kind of small impact, and Larry Elder, who's a radio host from California, who is not. The other people who are going to declare later this week include the governor of North Dakota, who no one's ever heard of, but who seems relatively sane and therefore will probably not win the nomination, and Chris Christie, who is neither sane nor likely to win the nomination. Basically, I think the overwhelming favorite has to be Trump. DeSantis is the only other one who appears to have a serious chance, and that's only because most people have never actually sat down and watched an interview of him or met him. I heard someone describe him recently as he's relatable, or at least he has Googled relatability. He's asked ChatGPT how to have a conversation. And yeah, there was a beautiful recording of an interaction with him in Iowa recently at a meet and greet with voters. And he says, "Hi, what's your name?" And the guy says, I'm Ken Branson. He says, "Okay." And that's the end of it. And then just silence. That's the end of the interaction. Yeah. So if you're interested on which ones,
one for having difficult conversations.
He's not one for having difficult conversations. If you're interested in who else to watch, maybe. I mean, some of the commentators are excited about Tim Scott. I personally don't think he's got a chance because they're excited about him because he's a little bit more reasonable, and so he's not going to make it. Vivek Ramaswamy could be interesting. I can't imagine him winning the nomination. I mean, he's a first-generation American practicing Hindu in a party that's increasingly Christian nationalist. He's also he seems more likely to be the sort of Andrew Yang of this election than anything else, but he's worth watching. It gets to the point about Democratic backsliding, though, because the way the Republicans choose their presidential candidate is effectively by a first-past-the-post competition among the 50 states. So each state in the U.S. holds a primary. In the Democratic Party, the percentage of vote that you get in that state's primary awards you a certain number of delegates to the party's national convention that chooses the president. In the Republican primary, whoever gets the highest percentage of votes in, I think, 9 out of 10 of their primaries gets all of the delegates for that state. So if Donald Trump is in a 10-candidate field, if Donald Trump is bringing in even 40% of the vote, he's almost certainly going to win, and he's currently polling at well over 60%. And if you don't believe me that he can win with 40%, in 2016, Donald Trump only got 35% of the votes in the Republican primary, and yet he swept the board because it's an undemocratic first-past-the-post system.
Well, there we go. A lot to say, can there?
The second question for you that's came in with is, what's your thoughts on Scotland having a constitution, given most countries have one? And obviously following on to that, would that help us get to independence?
Well, I'm easily the least qualified person in the room to say whether whether telling Scottish voters that we plan a constitution would help gen support for independence. And just in terms of having one, I think when you're starting out as a new country like Scotland, it would be fairly essential to have a constitution. What you have in the absence of a constitution is a situation in which any government that has 51% of the votes in the legislature theoretically could do anything, could theoretically vote away elections. It's only a constitution that, it's only constitutional protections that protect things like the right to free speech, the right to fair trial, the right to free and fair elections. I would imagine that after in an independent Scotland, there would have to be basically a constitutional convention in which parties from across the spectrum and people from all across Scotland had to come together to develop a guiding set of binding rules, which you would need a high supermajority of the legislature to overturn. And that's basically what a constitution ultimately is. This is difficult in a lot of countries because you need to bring together a document that commands more than, it has to command basically more than 70% support across the country at its outset to be legitimate. I think in Scotland it would be easier than a lot of countries because the only really properly anti-progressive party in the Scottish Parliament is the Scottish Conservatives, who only poll about 20% of the vote. I mean, they would definitely want to be included in a constitutional convention, but even if they objected to everything, as long as you had a broad agreement on a broad set of basic fundamental constitutional principles between the various stripes of progressive that you find in the SNP, Labour, Lib Dem, and Greens, you could still end up with a document that had close to 80% support at the outset, which is enough to launch a constitution. So I think Scotland is ideally placed after independence to put together a strong and workable constitution.
No, thanks for that. A comment from Adrian Latomsky, whose point we've covered earlier tonight is absolutely spot on. If the government here does insist on voter ID, it should provide an ID for everybody, which is the only fair way of doing that, to ensure that there's a level playing field and nobody is artificially disenfranchised. Mm-hmm. We'll bring the Yes Hub in now.
Great to see you all. Great to hear the debate.
How are things going at the Yes Hub? Anything you've been up to, Kenny, that you'd like to let everyone know about?
Talking to Johnny about doing something on local businesses and supporting local businesses, especially in the hospitality industry post-COVID. And one of Johnny's constituents runs a local cafe. She's going to do a piece for us on that. We're going to see her the next few days to take some footage of the cafe and have that prepared for our future iMatters. Just looking forward to the summer, and that we were out just promoting independence at the weekend. Chance with the good weather coming out and the positivity you get there to go out and just keep on championing independence where we can. So we're at Falkirk High Street at the weekend, and it was an astonishing positive response for who wants Scotland to be an independent country. I think we almost universally were positive in that, and all the people we engaged with, at least a good percentage. So everything's looking really encouraging, really, as we look forward to the summer. And the Yes movement, it's very much alive and well. The hub here is much well used and much appreciated. And as I said, we've got all these sort of community activists between the local businesses and friends from charities. That's another perspective item coming up. One of the local equality charities are keen to talk to us too. So we're just, as I said, spreading the good word and get people involved and get footage for future events. I think we also have more from Kirsty Heggie too, the folk singer. She's very much an up and coming talent in the Forth Valley, Central Scotland area, and we're fortunate to have her as a friend of the show. And so,
no, that's excellent to hear, Kenny. We've got some very interesting speakers coming up for future shows. Does the panel have any suggestions to prevent politics by reasons debate morphing into politics by cash, media, and corporate power?
I think that's answered in a post.
Who would like to go far on that anyway?
Strict campaign finance laws.
Yeah, I think that's very true. We have very strict rules in the UK, and I'm not the biggest fan of the UK, but its electoral rules aren't the worst in the world. They are still open to abuse, and they're certainly open to the people overspending through certain legal routes of national spending or pre-targeting and things. So it's not entirely a level playing field, but it is better than in many other places. Yeah, so I think we just need a much stricter set of controls there. I'm a bit of an electoral anorak, and I've often thought that one way of controlling and checking whether people are overspending or spending illegally would be to have an almost live accounting reporting system. That would be a nightmare for those of us in electoral politics, but it would be one way of making sure everybody stayed honest, and if something was going out on the streets, it ought to be being accounted for live, as it were. And if you've commissioned something, you've commissioned it, there's a cost centre coming in. So I think there's ways so that could be done, and it would certainly be verifiable on the ground. You would see a leaflet come through your door, and you would look up and say, "Oh, they've not declared this," or where did this come from? And I think that would be an interesting approach. So I've got some very unique views on how electoral rules could be tightened there. Those are not party views or even views I think that have been particularly advocated across the country, but
something people or a lot of systems forget to control for in campaign finance laws is limiting not just how much individuals can give to a campaign, but how much individuals can spend on their own campaign if they're running for election. It won't apply in most races, but we saw something like Michael Bloomberg becoming mayor of New York City for 12 years, basically because he could afford to buy all of the ad space in New York City throughout the campaign. It doesn't quite let you buy an election, but if you imagine 3 candidates standing on a stage, 2 of them have to use their voice and 1 of them is allowed to buy a bullhorn. It doesn't guarantee they'll win, but it gives them a very unfair advantage. I think that's just a small piece of it that the tartan tie wearing billionaire reminded me of.
I think another thing is pretty obvious is to cap the amount that you can donate to a party. So here we have to declare donations. I think it's about £50 that are made, but in Ireland, an anonymous donation cannot be made over £100. And then to a political party, the maximum you can donate is, I think, 6,350 a year to a party and 2,540 to a candidate, which, they're huge amounts of money still. But it's good that there's a cap, so you cannot donate more than that amount, no matter how hard you try. It's illegal. It's not about declaring your donation. It's just you can't give them that much money, or more than that much money, I should say. And that includes, obviously, what we would consider as donations here. So, discounts and work done for free that you would ordinarily charge for, stuff like that. So capping donation amounts is a really big thing that seems to me like it should be common sense, but is not something that's here, unfortunately. And I mean, it works well in some cases. I mean, obviously I'd say Labour are quite happy, and I would be quite happy, to be honest, about unions being huge donors in politics. But on the flip side, you've got billionaires being huge donors in politics, which I think is something that we need rid of. And obviously the SNP, we don't benefit from that as much as the other parties. Our donations, a lot of the time come from just our membership fees. I think it's like 60% of our money comes from membership fees or something like that, and that's like the £1 a month sort of stuff.
At the risk of interrupting you, Calum, Johnny and I are smiling here because we've been around so long that we remember when it was always the candidates put their own hand in their pockets and had to pay for everything. It was such a shoestring, and there's still a large element of that the committee basically overburdened by the pressures of a campaign. I can recall, I'll not name the names or embarrass any of the folk, but I recall one of the cash-strapped campaigns of years back, and in the campaign office with target letters, we didn't have envelopes. So we needed envelopes to target letters. So how many target letters do we have? We had, I can't remember, 20,000 or whatever we were putting out. And they just counted round, right, what do we need? Go to the envelope company. There was a company over in Bathgate, and went over to Bathgate to get the envelopes. But before we did that, we had a whip round. Everybody in the campaign office that night stuck 20 quid in so we could pay for the envelopes. I have to say, though, on a positive note, that they made sure those envelopes got stuffed and delivered in a way that I've never seen before in my campaign. It certainly put buy-in, but it's not really the way we wanted to do it, but it was the only way it could be done. So
at one time, all the boards that you put up on all the lampposts, and you had to do that. We quite liked doing that because we had the activists that actually could do it, where the Tories didn't have the activists. They couldn't be seen doing such a lowly job, a lot of them. So we were quite happy with that. But at the end of the day, when the council took the decision not to allow you to put the boards up on the lampposts, there was a big sigh of relief, I think, from most people. It wasn't so much putting them up. It was later on taking them all back down again.
Just to express our gratitude to both our guests, Bert and Calum, for joining us tonight. I hope it's not been too painful an experience for either. It's been very good fun. It's good fun for us. We like to talk to sane people from the real world instead of the nutters that we deal with down here all the time. So that's a real benefit. Hopefully the audience enjoyed it as well. Thank you to the guests, and thank you to Kevin at Independence Live for all the techie support. For getting the show up and running, to guys at the Yes Hub in Falkirk, and also, as I said earlier, to Linda Graham for Broadcasting Scotland for the new to us, the cameras that she's given us to improve the quality of our broadcast. All of it great, and it's good to see such parts of the Yes movement coming together, working together, and we just all have to spread that message that we are one big family, even when there are sometimes disagreements, because that is the strength of our movement, is our diversity.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion. If you'd like to catch regular episodes of I Matters for Westminster, check out Independence Live's YouTube channel, and we'll be back next Friday. So thanks for listening. Bye now.